Hi there. This red car behind us is called a Caboose. As a matter of fact, it's a very modern Caboose. Even though it was built 50 years ago, it was one of the last ones built. They quit making them in about 1978, 79. This car was built for the Missouri Pacific. You'll notice MoPac and Missouri Pacific Railroad, and it served the Missouri Pacific for many, many years until about in the middle of the 1980s. Now, believe it or not, the Missouri Pacific was bought out by the Union Pacific Railroad in about 1980s, 82, 84, something of that nature. And what happened then is they were able to eventually discontinue using cabooses altogether. Now, originally, when this was in service, it was strictly a rolling office for the conductor. Now, people may not know this, but the conductor is really the person in charge of the train, not the engineer. The engineer is just the driver, the conductor's in charge. So in this car, if you'll look at the bottom window, you'll see there's a desk. And we'll go inside, you'll see it. And that's where the conductor operated from. He kept track of everything on the train and all of the paraphernalia that they were worried about. Then if you look at the thing called the cupola on top, you'll see you had two people up there. Their job was to look down the train, making sure things weren't falling off of it or people weren't trying to get on it. They had a third mission, and that was to monitor air pressure. Trains and big trucks are very similar in that they rely on air pressure to keep the brakes off, and they rely on air pressure to put the brakes on. So monitoring the correct amount of air pressure is very important. Okay, now over time, the railroads began to wise up a little bit. They said, let's see if we can eliminate some of these positions. To do that, they first put like infrared sensors, the heat sensors, along the track, and the job of those was to make sure that there was no brakes that are dragging or getting too hot or a bearing that was going bad, so they could monitor that, okay? And then these sensor stations were every 5 or 10 miles. If they saw a bad bearing, then they could alert the locomotive and say, oh, look, you got a bad issue here. So that was one thing. The other one, over time, they began to put photo arrays, maybe on main lines every 30 miles or so apart. And those served for looking for things falling off the train or people trying to get on the train, okay? So that was two of the missions of the people up in the cupola. And the third was to monitor the air pressure. As I was telling you, air is very essential. You have to have air pressure on to keep the brakes off, and you use the same air pressure to lock up the brakes or to set the brakes. So they invented a third device called the end of train device. It's just a little square box about A stuff, and it would fit on the coupler, the coupler is that brownish rusty thing on the last car, and then hook it up to the air. So what happened? This negated the need for a caboose and the people that were in the top. So what the railroads were able to do was to move the conductor, who's still in charge of the train, to the locomotive with the engineer, okay? And then the other two guys, over time, were able to be retired or moved into other jobs. So then the railroad was able to get rid of cabooses altogether by the late 1980s. Now you still see them occasionally. It's what they call shoving platforms. They're all closed up, but if you're gonna push a bunch of freight cars, maybe 20 or 30 of them, then they'll get a person and put him on the open part back here, and then whether he's pushing a bunch of cars, that way they can kind of radio the engineer and say, hey, look, you got an issue, you need to stop, things of that nature. But that's what they're used for. Now, this particular one, when it was retired from service, it was sold to Dow Chemical. They used it in their yard, just essentially to ferry people back and forth. Then they donated it to a museum downtown, and then we got it, and I'm thinking like 2006, and it's been here since. Now, it's just recently been repainted inside and out, so it looks exactly the way it would have looked when it was in service, basically brand new. So now let's go inside and I'll show you this beautiful caboose. Okay, how you doing now? Anyway, we're inside the caboose. Everybody's here. You can see what it looks like inside. Now, just recently, we repainted the interior, and we got information from the Missouri Pacific Historical Society that this is exactly the color that it would have been painted when it was new. So what you see here is what it would have looked like essentially when it was brand new. Now, it always had a place to rest, this here. Now, it had pressurized water. This tank has air pressure to keep it, or give you a little pressure, so that the sink has pressure if you're going to get a drink of water out of it. Now, this is like an RV to some degree. It had a chemical toilet with a holding tank, which was very appropriate for the 1970s when it was built. Now, it did have heat. It had no air conditioning. This would go up to the flue here, and that tank held diesel fuel, and that was what was used to heat this stove. Now, down here in South Texas, you probably didn't need to fire the heater up very often, but there was no air conditioner, okay? One other thing, the lights you see, when it was in service, they were battery operated. So what happens is we had a charger, if you will, or on one of the wheels, so that when it was rolling down the tracks, it could clearly charge the batteries up. And that's one of the reasons, if we go forward, that we have these ice chests. They were essential for any kind of cold drink that you might have. So that's why the ice chests are here. They were original equipment. All of these cabinets were used to store supplies, flares, things they may need in an emergency. Now, if you look up, you see this gauge? That's the air gauge. These two guys are up here. One of their primary purposes is to make dang sure the air gauge didn't get to blow like 95 pounds, because then things were going to go funky. Now, if something really did go bad, what they could do is what they call dump the air. You see this lever? If things were going bad, they could click it down and it would dump the air and stop the train. So it's like an emergency brake. There's not only one here, but there's one on both ends of the car as well. It's like an emergency brake. The steering wheel looking things the kids ask me about are really hand brakes. They're not steering wheels, they're hand brakes. Now, these were where the people were. Until the train goes by. But, okay, the kids, if you'd like, they can go up in the top and they can look out through the windows. When this was in service, this chair would have been centered, and it rotates back and forth, so you could always be looking down the train. So what I'm saying is it would flip either way, so you always can look down the tracks. And like I said, this is where the chemical toilet was. And now it's where the air conditioner is. Thank God for that in the summertime. So this is the caboose, the conductor's desk. If you'll notice, there's a high back. And this is kind of like in your car when you have the seat, the headrest, because they would have what they call slack action. As a train started, each little coupler may have an inch or so of slack. And when you got to the caboose, it could really whack you back. So they were all seat belted in, and they had these tall black chairs. So, and the conductor used this desk to keep track of everything. And like I said, when they were retired, the conductor and his desk moved to the engine, and the other two fellows that were on top got retired. So this was essentially a rolling office when it was in service. All right, you'll notice that there is a train over here on the Union Pacific. The Kansas City Southern leases trackage rights from Beaumont to about 1.5 miles. If you're about where the last of the train going around that bend is, and that's where they own their own tracks all the way down to Victoria, and then they lease some more trackage, and then into Laredo, and then they own the tracks in Mexico. As a matter of fact, they're one of the biggest railroads in Mexico. And you can see the back here, this is the Kansas City Southern guys pushing that big train. So he has like 2 or 3 in the front, and at least 1 in the back pushing the rest of the concept. Now, interestingly, maybe every day or every other day, there's a train from Mexico that's carrying crude oil. Pemex, the Mexican oil oil company determined that it was cheaper to actually buy a refinery in the east part of Houston area than it was to upgrade the one that they had in Tampico to be able to handle the crude oil if they had now. So what they do is they bring the crude oil up from Mexico, process it here, and then they take it back as refined gasoline or product to Mexico. It's cheaper. The railroad is loving it because they get all kinds of revenue from carrying it up and back. So probably once a day, sometimes every other day, we'll see oil coming from Mexico be processed here. Another interesting little tidbit.